Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Professor Molawa, for that wonderful, inspiring introduction. I think it's really important we focus on this issue that this should not be a talking shop. We should look for practical outcomes. And I'm going to do the wrapping up at the end of today, and I think perhaps what I'll do is ask you all to talk about what you'll take away with you in terms of innovations, potential new ways of doing things, potential action points. But this morning I'm going to try and set the scene a little bit with lots and lots of data. And I hope the data really is more of a way of helping us understand what's happening and a way of prompting and promoting the important conversations that we'll have. I mentioned last night at the dinner, for the benefit of those of you who weren't with us, the transformation of Africa in the World University Rankings has been extraordinary. Just a few years ago in 2015, when Times Higher Education held the first ever THE Africa University Summit on the campus at UJ, there were only 4 ranked universities. Last year's ranking 2019, there was almost 50 from Africa. And I revealed last night that in the 2020 rankings, which we'll publish in September, we've had over 70 submissions from African universities. So the visibility of African universities in the global rankings is increasing dramatically, which I think is very, very positive. And I'll share data today which actually shows the tremendous progress that's being made in Africa, some really positive signs of improvement, as well as reflecting on some of the existing challenges. But I was also highlighting the fact that while I believe passionately that African universities must compete on a global stage, I think Chilidzi has made it absolutely clear how vital it is that African universities are producing new knowledge, are competing at the highest level on the global stage, are not losing talent to the global north, not losing talent to the Western universities. I think it's vital that we have universities that compete, but I also think the rankings themselves have to reflect and better recognize the unique characteristics, the unique challenges of African universities. So I'm going to look at 2 different rankings today. I'm going to analyze Africa's performance in the world rankings, and then I'm going to look at something very new and exciting that Times Higher Education created just this year, actually, which we call the University Impact Rankings. That's a ranking based on universities' contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, back in 2015, when we were here at the Africa University Summit, we promised we'd go away and listen and learn and come back with metrics that better reflect Africa's priorities and its political demands and requirements. And I think this impact ranking goes a long way to have delivered on those promises, although it is a pilot and we want to keep developing it and evolving it with you in partnership. So we'll look at both of them, and I'll try and leave some time at the end so we can discuss and challenge and scrutinize the methodologies. And then, of course, actually, there's further sessions today which will allow us to continue to do that. So first of all, let's look at the World University Rankings. I think we can't look at the data and what it tells us without understanding the methodology. So just to give you a sense of what's in there, it's a huge piece of work. We analyze almost 70 million individual citations to research published across the world. We're actually looking at just around 13 million individual research items, so papers, journal articles, book chapters. We're gathering from universities themselves around 230,000 data points. So thank you to the universities who supply us with basic information about themselves, faculty numbers, student numbers. That helps us to create a really powerful global database helping us understand universities across common data sets around the world. And then we combine all that data with over 20,000 responses to an academic reputation survey. We have a lot of data on the quality of research in higher education, but we also think it's important to supplement that with questions for university leaders and academics themselves. Who do you think is doing great work? Which departments and which universities are exciting you as a scholar? Whose research are you reading and getting excited about? Who's doing great work? And it's a bit more current than citations, which often take significant time to build up. And then for the World University Rankings 2019, published last September, we were able to rank 1,258 institutions across 86 different countries. So it's a huge, huge piece of work. We take all of those data sets, all of the input data, and then we create what I think is the most balanced and the most comprehensive ranking system in the world. We have 13 separate performance indicators. So apologies if you're over there, but so these are the three sources: the data the universities themselves submit, the survey data that we carry out, the 20,000 responses, and then this is the Scopus database. That's the 13 million publications and the 70 million citations. So these three data sources go into 13 separate performance indicators that covers the whole range of a university's activity. And we bundle those 13 indicators into these 5 core areas: citations, teaching, research, international outlook, industry income. I'm going to walk through those one by one because later on we'll show you some data on the performance of universities here against each one of those 13 metrics. So I'm just going to walk through them quickly. I'm going to cough. I'll just make sure I don't cough into my microphone. Excuse me. So first of all, citation impact. 30%, the highest weighted single indicator, is basically an analysis of research excellence based on counting those citations. So it's all field weighted. We do not accept rankings that just count all citations and all citations are good. These are all put in the context of the publication behavior and publication culture of each subject. So we create global benchmarks for more than 300 individual subject areas, find out what the average citation for every publication across that subject is, and then we measure your university against that. So what we're doing really is looking at how many times the research paper is quoted by others, is cited by others, how much that paper is contributing to new knowledge, how much of it is contributing to new knowledge as we talked about this morning. So that's the sort of flagship indicator. It's size independent. You don't have to produce lots of research. You just have to produce high quality, highly impactful research. The other research areas look at 3 aspects: papers to academic staff. That is simply a productivity metric. How many papers are your faculty publishing into the global index journals? And that's 23,000 journals indexed by Scopus. We don't want to put too much weight on just producing more and more papers. We'd rather put the most weight on the quality of those papers, but I do think it's indicative of the institution you're in if you're able to sort of say, look, we are publishing in the relevant globally referenced journals. Then we look at income, scaled for the size of the university, but your ability of your faculty to draw in research income is a really vital input metric. And then reputation, 18% is based on the survey of 20,000 academics. Who do they say is doing great work based on reading each other's papers, attending conferences, hiring each other's grad students, et cetera, et cetera. So 60% is already going into research. The world rankings are very, very research-led. Teaching, 30%. We have to accept that at the world stage on a global platform, it's very, very difficult to measure teaching. We actually have a whole range of teaching metrics. We do a US college ranking with the Wall Street Journal, which is all about the student experience, student outcomes, student success. We're doing that in Europe and Japan. But for the world rankings, what we really are looking at is what we call the teaching environment. We're not looking at outcomes. You know, they're measured in different ways across different countries. We're not looking at inputs. I don't actually believe that entry standards are a measure of quality anyway. You shouldn't judge universities on how hard they are to get in. You should judge them on what they do with the student. So we use a series of proxies. We use the Teaching Reputation Survey. So again, asking peers themselves, academics, who's doing great teaching. When you're bringing in PhDs, when you're bringing in postdocs, where did they get their training? Have they come from a great university? How much do you believe the teaching at those universities are good? We look at a basic metric, a staff-student ratio. We know it's simplistic. You can't always tell how great the food is at a restaurant by how many staff are serving you, but I think it's important to say there's an environment on campus where a student is likely to be able to interact and spend time with their tutor, with their faculty. So staff-student ratio is in there. We look at income. It's a harsh reality, but I think the level of resource available to an institution is an important metric around teaching. We do apply purchasing price parity, so we reflect the economic inequalities in the world, but it's a metric of input, but it's indicative of the environment. And then we take this rather Humboldtian ideal of a university. We understand that with the world-class research universities we're trying to measure in rankings, in the world rankings, that this idea that students are actually gaining from being in a research-rich environment is core, that they can mingle with active researchers, they mingle with people on the top of their field. So we look at the doctorates to academic staff ratio and the doctor to bachelor ratio. So they're kind of research-led, but they're still in our teaching environment. The reason we do those doctorates to bachelors is to sense the research intensity of the teaching environment. And this is Karl Jasper's 1923 talking about the earlier Humboldtian model, that university is a community of scholars engaged in seeking truth. It's intended not merely as a place of instruction. The student is to participate actively in research, and from this experience, it was always probably a he back in 1923 in Germany, he is to acquire the intellectual discipline and education which will remain with him for life. And I think in today's environment, it's probably more important that we subject students to this research environment, problem solving, asking questions, going off and finding the answers to questions themselves, not a passive recipient of the lecturer's wisdom. It's actually a shared process. So that's what we're trying to get at with that metric. Knowledge transfer, we think it's vital that we look at the third mission of a university, its ability to interact with industry. We have loads of new metrics ideas for this around, university industry co-authors publications, patents, spin-outs. But when we created this ranking back in 2009-10, this was the best proxy we had. So we look at your ability to draw funding from the private sector. If a university can persuade a big corporate to hand over its R&D money to a university, it's a great sign that that university is close to industry, close to the private sector. It's given a low weighting because it's a very, very tricky metric. Universities, certainly back in 2010, had a very limited ability to report this. But it's something we'll expand and develop as we develop the next generation of rankings. International outlook, this is my favorite metric. How international are you? If you're a global research university, clearly you need to be international. You need to be drawing in international faculty, you need to be drawing in international students, and you need to be collaborating with partners around the world. We won't solve these grand challenges, food security, climate change. We won't be able to tackle the fourth industrial revolution if we're not collaborating and sharing our research ideas. Knowledge is to be shared. So we have this metric here. So it's partly a metric of your position in the market, but it's also an inherent good. And it's given a modest weighting, but I think that's the key to success, really. The more you share and partner and draw in international talent, the better. This was the explanation for why it's so important to build international teams from Alice Gass, the president of Imperial College London. She talked about this idea in botany of hybrid vigor. This idea that individuals brought up in different educational systems with exposure to different societies and markets approach problems differently. International teams broaden and augment individual thinking. And I think that's absolutely vital. We want to bring different talents, different cultures, different experiences together to create a greater, the sum of its parts is greater than the individuals. So let's look at the analysis of the rankings data. So this is really drawn out of the World University Rankings for 2019. So the current data set, I'm going to pull out some information for Africa. The first thing I do is just look at the global representation in the overall ranking. 1,258 universities. The darkness there you can see is the score for the country, the median ranking score for the country. It's roughly a scale of 100 to 0. It's not exactly, it's a Z-score that we create. But you can see there the highest represented country is the United States. It also has a really, really strong average score. Japan is the next highest represented nation, but actually high in volume of universities within that ranking, but they're not performing as well. The United Kingdom is third. And then you can see some performances from China, Italy, Germany, etc. But I just thought I'd highlight a few of the African nations. You can see Egypt is the most represented from Africa, but actually at a relatively low overall average score. And South Africa there is the second best represented, but actually with a stronger overall average. I think South Africa quite clearly, perhaps in terms of its relative wealth within the African continent, is a really strong performer. You've got Nigeria, Tunisia with the same number of institutions, but Nigeria showing stronger performance. But it's just a flavor. We have a really decent, diverse range of African universities in the ranking. I think 10 African countries overall made the overall list. I just wanted to say a word about what I think you all know, which is how important wealth, national wealth is. This just basically shows the wealth of nations judged by gross domestic product per capita on the bottom horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis is the average ranking score. And the size of the bubble is actually the proportion of the youth population that these the ranked universities actually teach. But actually, I think the most stark thing about that is how clear the correlation is between national wealth and ranking performance. It's a really, really clear line. But then there's some really interesting outliers. Singapore, probably the most knowledge-intensive nation on earth, a tiny city-state bursting with great universities and an amazing research base. Hong Kong, similar in the sense it's a hub of excellence, an international melting pot of great universities. The Netherlands, a really, really good performer. But something that really surprised me and I think is worth celebrating and a really positive sign is South Africa and Uganda. Relatively very, very poor compared to the rich nations, but punching way above their weight. Way above the trend line there in terms of providing good outcomes, strong universities, good research, with a really relatively, very limited funding base. So huge credit to universities in these countries punching above their weight. The problem, I guess, there is you see, obviously, the bubble for Uganda is very small, so the universities up there in that ranking are only educating a very small proportion of the population. But it's still really, really positive in that sense. So now I'm going to look at the performance across these 13 metrics. So each one of these, I'm not sure how familiar you are with box and whiskers plots. I'm not a statistician, but what this is showing you is the total distribution of the world's scores for each of our 13 different metrics that I've walked through. So sorry, it's quite small, but you see PhD to bachelor's, PhD awarded, teaching reputation, income scaled for the size of the university. The three here are the international metrics. You've got international faculty. In the middle there is international co-authorship, and that's international students. The big purple one is citation impact, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really the distribution of the entire world, the 1,258 universities. The line in the middle is the median score, the average score for the whole world of each of these metrics. You can see the two that stand out are reputation. We have this problem if you ask 20,000 scholars around the world who are the greatest universities, there's a huge concentration of nominations for Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge. So the distribution is much more skewed. There's a really long tail there. But what I'm going to do now is just overlay Africa's scores. So this is the world, and that's Africa. So what you can immediately see there, I think, is some really serious disadvantages. The most important one, I think, is the university income. So this one here is income scaled for the size of the university by its faculty. So it's an income to staff ratio. But you see the Africa compared to the world, there's just much less resource going into African universities. You can see it the same with research income. It's not quite as extreme for research income. So total income, it's a big issue. Research income, it's still a huge challenge. So you've got that inherent disadvantage of the relative lack of funding. I think the other thing to really highlight is this area of internationalization. I think this is indicative of perhaps the historical inequalities that we've already mentioned. You've got a very limited ability to pull in international faculty, so you're not attracting faculty from even inside Africa across borders. And the same with students, but there's a huge really, really positive sign of international collaboration. This is research co-authorship, which normally is a great indicator of strength, that you're collaborating with everyone in the world. But the worry for me is that there's a slightly unequal element there, because it's not translating into citation impact. Usually that collaboration leads to highly cited research or more highly cited research. So you've got high collaboration but low research impact. So I think there's some structural issues there that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But looking at those challenges and the slightly negative aspects, I think it's really, really, really exciting to say it's actually getting a lot better. So this actually shows the year-on-year change across those 13 metrics. So overall overall the whole continent of Africa, not just South Africa, the whole continent of Africa improved. The blue line there is the overall positive upward movement for Africa in the world rankings. It's over 2.5%, 2.5 points in the scale. I'll put that into context later. But what you can see here is that there's been a drop. So the red it shows a negative, a drop in performance from last year, and the green as an improvement. So overall, a big, big improvement. A couple of negatives there, but actually most of these are green. The most exciting thing for me is African universities are becoming more productive. You're producing more papers, and more of those papers are going into the world's leading journals indexed by Scopus. But much more importantly than the higher volumes of research, which is very positive, is the higher impact. A really impressive improvement in the citation impact score. So more research is being published, and more of that research is more highly cited and therefore has a higher impact. So that's extremely positive. And also in terms of capacity building, there was a positive increase in PhDs awarded. So you're producing more of the next generation of researchers, producing more PhDs. Teaching reputations improving. Research income and industry income has been modestly improving. This could be a really important one there, industry income. Is that a way of leveraging more money, bringing in more money, becoming less dependent on government, working harder with the private sector to draw in more funding? And I just wanted to put it in context. So that's Africa up to 2.5, slightly over 2.5 points. Everyone talks about Asia's rise, Asia's incredible improvement in world rankings. They have risen, but actually it's 1.4. So Africa's relative improvement is much greater. Africa's improving at a greater rate than Asia, albeit from a slightly lower starting point. But that's Asia's rise. And then South America's even more modest still. So Africa is actually making greater progress, which I think is a really, really positive sign. So this is something I'm just going to grab some water. This is something I haven't revealed before. This is the ranking for Africa. You can still hear me. So when we published the rankings in September, we filtered the rankings for Africa, but we actually put a lot of information into bands. So a lot of this is hidden away. When we get to the lower rankings and the 200s and the 300s and the 400s, we group universities in bands and put them in alphabetical order. So exclusively just for this meeting, and just for this forum, this group, I've actually separated the band. I've clarified the banding and actually put them in the rank order according to score. So I'm really happy to show you that's the top 10 universities of Africa according to the 2019 World Rankings. What you can see really is that at the bottom of that top 10, we're separating out universities that were banded together in the rankings. So congratulations to UJ, number 8 in Africa. Of course, Cape Town, as you might expect, at number 1. And I know we have the president of Pretoria here as well, so congratulations. And then we have the next 10. Ibadan is there in 13th. We'll hear later from the president of Ibadan. So that's just a little exclusive hierarchy for you, just to whet the appetite and have a conversation. But I'll move on. We'll share these slides with all the delegates. But just looking at individual performers, I think it's worth highlighting, Cape Town's improvement's really been due to Publications per staff, research income, teaching reputation, so very positive for Cape Town, pushing forward, rising up the rankings. Not quite as, make sure I've got I think my slides are frozen. Should I point it towards the back? It doesn't seem to be moving on actually, is it? I don't know if it's the battery or... Any advice, guys, around what I can do about this? Can't really do it without the visuals because it's all data. Do the old trusty give it a knock. That doesn't look like it's the battery. Mm-hmm. There you go. So it's everyone I've clicked. I'll go back where I was. I should have at least left the. Thank you. I should have at least left the rankings up there so you could just spend more time on that. So Cape Town, really good improvement. Makerere, not so good, a slight dip actually, and that's really been down to the drop in citation impact. Remember, this is all relative to the rest of the world, so even if you're improving, if others are improving more rapidly, it's a challenge. Suez Canal, the Egyptians have started to do really, really well, actually. So Suez Canal had a very strong improvement in citation impact, and that's driven its overall performance. Everything else flatlined. Ibadan, an incredibly good performance for citation impact. So again, pretty modest across the range, barely any change, but a really big boost for citation impact. So again, Ibadan's research is being more highly cited by scholars around the world, having a higher impact. So that's a really good sign that the quality of research at Ibadan has been improving significantly. Ghana, actually a small drop, not dramatic, but income's dragging it down. That big red one there is a drop in income, research income relative to the rest of the world. Actually a decent improvement in citations, but overall pulled down by income primarily. Nairobi, modest decline, driven by research becoming slightly less impactful. And Sidi Mohammed bin Abdallah University, a really good improvement, again driven by citation impact. Citation impact is the key metric. It's the highest weighted area. And ultimately, if you're producing stronger research, more highly cited, that will drive ranking performance. That's the key driver in terms of making a significant change. This just looks at reputation. It's just taken some of the highest regarded universities in our reputation survey across the continent. And it looks where the votes are coming from. And you can see here actually that Cape Town has the highest number of votes in Africa. It obviously is the #1 ranked university in Africa, the most reputed. But you can see actually what's quite healthy about this is it's getting a good proportion of votes from all over the world. Lots from Africa, but actually a significant number from Asia, plenty of votes from Europe, plenty from North America, and a few modest results from Oceania and South America. But what I would say about this really is just a sort of tactical issue that there's probably a little bit of a challenge to suggest that too many African universities are too dependent on votes from inside Africa. I think African universities, all universities really should aspire to having a global footprint, a global network, and actually to be recognized by academics all over the world and not be too dependent on your neighbors and your friends for reputation. So reach out, collaborate, even down to things like marketing and public relations and communications. If you've got great work, go out and tell the world. Strategically target partners in South America. I think in China in particular, there's a huge appetite for Africa-China collaboration, for example. So outside Cape Town, you see that actually some of the other universities are a little bit more dependent on African votes. Ibadan is actually quite good. You've got a good, really decent number of votes from North America, but mainly Ibadan is Africa, North America, and then the others, I think, become more and more dependent on Africa. Very good mix of subjects. So across the world, these universities are highly regarded across a wide range of subjects, which I think is very positive. So a healthy, mixed economy, a real balance. Cape Town seems to be more highly regarded for clinical health and social sciences, but actually very, very nicely balanced. So again, it's a very healthy sign of a mixed economy, comprehensive provision across these universities. Just a really quick note to say that actually there's quite often a difference between global perceptions and national perceptions. The blue is the results of votes for Cape Town from within South Africa, and the orangey color is votes from outside. And it's quite interesting to see that the world sometimes perceives the university differently from the nation. And all that really suggests for me is that something we put in our tool is suggested, is there a communications issue? If the world doesn't quite recognize how strong the institution is in key areas, is there a case of going out there and telling the story more powerfully, communicating more effectively, collaborating, actively forging partnerships? So if this suggests Cape Town is very well known for life sciences, clinical and health, physical sciences, within South Africa, it's much less known outside. And actually the rest of the world seems to perceive Cape Town as being super strong in social sciences. So is that perception something that the university can exploit? And is the sense that people don't recognize the strengths in other areas something they can go out and change through communications, through partnerships, through collaborations? Just a quick one for Ibadan. The picture is similar, but actually you see there social sciences, again, there's a difference in perception. Physical sciences are different in perception. So all I'm really saying there is actually sometimes that this data, the reputation survey data we have, you can break it down, who's voting for you, which countries, which subjects. And it's a really nice way of trying to understand how the world sees you. And if the world sees you differently from how you see yourself, it presents some really good strategic opportunities. How do you go out and change those perceptions? How do you go out and exploit the good reputation that you have, build stronger alliances, build stronger networks? And this is the final slide on the world rankings, because I want to move on to the impact rankings. But this is something I think is very, very positive. I've just chosen clinical and health, but we call this a SWOT analysis. So the vertical is the research reputation score, so the subjective votes, perception, who thinks you're really good amongst your peers around the world. And the horizontal is your citation score. What does the hard data show is your great strengths? So you've got the quadrants. Really, I would suggest we'd really say this quadrant is strength. You're seen to be good, you're perceived to be good, and the data, the hard data, shows you are good. This is a real weakness area that people think you're good, but the data doesn't show you are, that you're actually perceived to be good, and actually the data doesn't back it up, so there's a real risk that that will fall. This, I think, is considered a weakness area, that you don't have reputation and the quality isn't amazing through citations. But the really exciting thing for me is this what we call the opportunity quadrant. The hard data proves and shows that there's some really strong research in clinical and health subjects at these universities. I hope you can read it, but it's Ibadan, it's Makerere, Suez Canal, and the black one there is Cape Town. So what this says to me is that actually Africa, at least these institutions I've picked out in this field, are poised for great potential, because we know you're doing great work, but you're not perceived for that great work. So actually, it's much easier to tell the story and show and share your strengths. And then those strengths build and grow because there's more collaborative partners, more opportunities for research collaboration. And you can do that through communications. You can do that through PR and marketing. You can't build the excellent research through PR and marketing, but you can tell everyone about it through PR and marketing. So for me, this is great. We know there's a great core strength of good research there, and that can only be built on and strengthened. So my takeaway for the world rankings is actually great potential. Africa is improving. As a nation, individual universities are improving. and they're poised for really, really positive things. I'm just going to take a drink of water. So that's the world rankings, and I believe passionately that African universities should aspire to be ranked on the world rankings. They are the best research universities in the whole world. You need to be on that platform with Stanford and Harvard and Baty and Tsinghua and Tokyo and anyone else in the world, Oxford and Cambridge. It's important, it's vital that African universities compete at that level, benchmark themselves at that level, collaborate and partner with universities at that level. So I'm really excited that so many African universities are in the world rankings, and they should be, and they should engage. But, as I mentioned earlier, we do also recognize that the rankings aren't necessarily perfect for all African universities. They don't necessarily reflect a lot of priorities for African universities. We talked yesterday at the President's Roundtable. I think it was you, Phil Cotton from Rwanda, who said, actually, do we need to decolonize the rankings? Some of these metrics are inherently favorable to the global north, inherently favorable to English language speaking nations. You know, there's journal articles and journal citations. There's clubs of publishers and editors and peer reviewers who are all sitting in the universities in America. So I think it's true, we must accept that African universities should compete on that stage, but also we need to try and work out and reflect metrics that also suit African needs and African priorities, and they're not always going to be trying to be like Harvard or Stanford. So we actually produced this year the World Impact Rankings, a completely different set of metrics, a completely different ranking, but it's something that I think is extremely positive for all universities in the whole world, but particularly I think could be strong for Africa. So the principle of this is what are we doing it for? First of all, we want to try and understand how universities make a positive impact on the world beyond pure scholarly excellence. How does that scholarly excellence translate into real action, real change on the ground? Prove the HE sector is doing its bit to contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Showcase great performance of universities outside rankings, not covered by traditional rankings. And be fair to universities. Understand the world rankings perhaps idealize a Western, North American model of a great university. Recognize there's different types of excellence and recognize the different size and shapes of universities. And we decided the best way to do that was use the SDGs as a framework. I think partly it's because the world has convened around the SDGs and agreed them, and there's consensus that they are the priorities for change and making the world a better place. So it was easy for us to say, well, we'll use the framework that's already been agreed by the world. It removes a bit of responsibility from Times Higher Education. So we don't get to say what the priority should be. The UN has already determined that. But also this understanding that they're a shared responsibility. It's not just the rich nations, it's everyone. It's a completely collective endeavor. And this idea that ending poverty does have to go hand in hand with strategies for economic growth, addressing social needs, and keeping a really, really close eye on extremely esoteric problems like climate change and environmental degradation. So Times Higher Education, in building the metrics, excuse me, we've decided to look at three aspects of performance. We do look at research, because we want to say that you're contributing to new ideas, contributing to new knowledge in these areas. But actually, it's a much more narrowly defined. We pick out very specific pieces of research using algorithms to pull out specific terms and specific references to direct research within that specific SDG. So if it's on climate action, we'd actually pull out just a range of research papers explicitly addressing climate change. If it's gender equality, we'd pull out that work. Then we look at stewardship. How are you actually using your own resources? So with climate action, you might be producing research that's helping us improve energy supply, come up with renewables, reduce waste, reduce carbon. But what about yourselves? Are you actually living your own ideal? So as a university, are you being cautious about the environment? Are you recycling? Are you being responsible with your energy consumption? etc., etc. So your own stewardship internally is something we're judging. And then outreach, absolutely vital. And Chilidze has talked passionately about how important universities are in their societies, in their communities. We have a really clear sense of outreach. Are you working with NGOs? Are you working with governments? Are you working with policymakers? Are you working with your communities to fight and tackle the SDGs? The lovely thing about this as well is anyone can join in the world rankings because it's so research-led. We say you have to publish 1,000 research papers over 5 years to be included. It's only for research universities. The metrics for research wouldn't work if you're not a research university. This is open to any university. You pretty much have to just be officially recognized in some capacity through some accreditation, which is great. It's completely open to everyone. We also then don't discriminate against universities with more limited internal data capacity. So you don't have to submit to every SDG. Actually, we've selected 11 in the first pilot. We'll do all 17 eventually, but we do 11 SDGs, and then the number 17, which is the partnerships. But you can choose the 3 strongest areas, so you don't have to be doing everything for everyone. If you're a local institution with a very clear focus on local economic growth, for example, you can focus on that. You can pick the ones you're good at. So it's good that you're not demanding huge internal data capacity, but also that you can be focused and you don't have to be doing all of it. And then we rank against the individual SDGs as well as an overall ranking. So to try and make it fair, no entry criteria. You don't have to submit to all SDGs. We listened to universities, we consulted quite widely. We publish it against the individual SDGs, so it's not just the overall who's making the most impact, it's who's making the most impact in specific areas. And then we use a bit of banding again to reflect the uncertainty of scores lower down the list. Excuse me. So the overview, basically, what we do is you can submit to as many as you want, or as many as the 11 as you want, but in order to create the overall score, the overall ranking for impact, you have to submit to 17. That's partnership for the goals. We say that you won't be ranked at all unless you can show that you're partnering with others, that you're working with NGOs, you're working with other universities. So you must all submit to 17, SDG 17, partnership for the goals, and then we'll take your best 3 out of all the other 11 that we collect data on. And that's the scoring mechanism, basically, to create the overall. But actually, I think one of the areas we might want to discuss, do we need an overall ranking? Should we just rank by the individual SDGs? It's quite an arbitrary process to say, you know, Stanford and Johannesburg will both be ranked overall, but it may be that Johannesburg's looking at equalities, economic growth, and pick one out of the air, sustainable cities, and Stanford's looking at climate action, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an interesting challenge about how we present the data. Just an example of methodology. So it's actually, each one is quite complex. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's far too complex. But for the 16 peace, justice, and strong institutions, we're pulling out your research into law and international relations. So that's using the research databases. With governance, we have a pick list. We simply ask you, do you have various policies? Do you have various procedures? We look at your participation in local, regional, and national government. Again, a pick list. We actually just say, are you doing the following things? Yes or no, tick box kind of approach. And then how many students you actually graduate into law and enforcement-related courses. And this is the kind of thing we're asking. So we've got the pick list, you know, do you have an elected representation on the governing body? Do you recognize the students' union? The existence of participatory bodies that include local residents? Do you have policies on organized crime and corruption? Do you have policies guaranteeing academic freedom, et cetera, et cetera? Excuse me. Working with government, expert advice. Are you providing government advice to government? Are you feeding into the policy debate? Are you generating research at the request of government? So this is extremely hard to measure because it's self-reported, it's tick list, it's volunteered. So we have this really painstaking, extremely challenging process of very large numbers of researchers who check it. You submit you say you're doing it, we ask for evidence that you're doing it, and then we review that evidence. So we'll give you a point for saying you're doing it, we'll give you more points for saying here's the document that proves we're doing it, and even more points to say this document's available in the public domain and it's being accessed. So this is a really radical new approach to rankings. It's extremely hard work, but I think it's really, really important. Another quick example in climate action. Again, research into that field, your own low carbon energy use. So again, the stewardship, are you living your own ideals? And then environmental education. So a few other examples within climate action: proportion of papers in the top 10% of journals in that area, field-weighted citation impact, but also this idea of stewardship. Are you providing local education around the impact of climate change? What's your own internal climate action plan? How are you working with governments and NGOs? So a very, very different approach to the traditional ranking. Note on policies, we're asked for your policies, but we do expect, if you say, well, if we say you need to have a minimum wage policy, or you have to have recognition of employment rights, because actually some of them secure work, decent work, that's one of the SDGs. We want evidence, and actually the law isn't enough. We want to see that you're not just subject to the law, but you actually have a policy that helps you demonstrate how you implement the law. But just to say, this is very subjective. We literally have people looking at your policies, ticking a box, saying that you have one, looking for evidence that it's in the public domain. So it's a really different approach. But let's just have a look at Africa's participation. So this was a pilot. It was extremely onerous on the universities to submit vast amounts of data, and entirely new data. So I admit we imposed a very large burden on universities. We demanded a very high amount of workload and effort. But I'm absolutely delighted that well over 500 universities took part in the first pilot. And I'm really, really delighted that 35 of those universities were from Africa. So this is who was participating. Pretty poor from North America, 48 across the whole of North America. We had a few stars like NYU, but some of the big names like Stanford, MIT, they sat it out. They've talked about moving in, doing it this year. But I think they were thinking, well, we've got lots to lose and nothing to gain. We're already at the top of all the rankings, so let's just wait it out. 61 from Latin America, 187 from Europe, 23 from Australia, 117 from East Asia, 56 from Central Asia. But the 35 from Africa, I think, was a really, really promising start for a pilot, and for a pilot that made such a heavy demand on universities' time and energy. We recognize internal capacity to give all this data is really challenging. I don't know what it is, but Egypt seems to be obsessed with rankings. They have more submissions into the world rankings. They had more submissions than anybody else. So we talk about Africa, but actually a lot of North Africa is included in this. So Egypt had 16 universities overall that were ranked. A couple unranked. It was maybe that they'd submitted, but we didn't have quite enough information, or they didn't quite fulfill all the minimum criteria. But it's a good sign. South Africa, only one ranked, and a couple who at least started the process, began the process. Tunisia is 3, Algeria 3, Nigeria 2. So it's a really good start for a pilot, and we're actually opening up the data collection for year 2, I think in October. So a much longer period for collecting data, much more time to get it right, and at least some experience now as well of how it works, and some good advice from us and our teams around helping you submit. These were the most popular across the world. Obviously partnerships, because that was compulsory, but education was the most popular after the compulsory one. It's interesting actually, because we're not asking for education as in your own undergraduate teaching. We're asking for your contribution to the wider education, so your production of qualified teachers, that sort of thing. Health was next, and then innovation. Innovation was quite popular because it's got all the economic growth areas in. But in terms of Africa, you see there again, partnerships was the most popular, education second, and health joint second. But interestingly, Africa, gender was a really big one. I mean, obviously, we're talking about 35 institutions, so low submission numbers. But that's the sort of the way Africa chose to participate. Gender strong, education and health both strong, obviously partnerships. This is the submission detail, so which countries submitted to what. But as you can see, because Egypt had the highest number, they dominate that list. But if you just look at the green, which is South Africa, you can see, gender was important there. Quality education, good health and well-being. But again, these are only 35, so you almost can boil it down to individual universities. But what I'll do now is just, quickly on Africa, this was relative to the rest of the world, which ones were more popular, which ones were less popular in terms of submission. So you can see there the actual most popular one above and beyond the rest of the world was good health and well-being. Feels very natural, of course, in Africa, some serious health issues, some great health expertise. But also gender equality, so health, gender equality, and obviously what I was saying earlier, quality education were more popular in Africa compared to the rest of the world. But just looking at the overall rankings, I think that what was really exciting for me is that in the traditional world rankings, you tend to see African universities coming in, submitting data, sharing, getting involved, but actually coming in at those lower levels in the sort of 800, 700, 600s. What was really exciting about this one is you're getting African universities joining this ranking, but starting in really good positions. So Egypt had a top 100 university in the whole world in the overall impact ranking, the composite ranking. But you've obviously got quite a, South Africa and Egypt both having universities in the 100 to 200 band, and also Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria with the 201 to 300 band. So it's nice that it's a global ranking and you are competing with the entire world, north and south, that African universities are starting to come in and show quite prominently they're making a difference on impact. So it kind of justifies this idea that this is a ranking that will not just privilege the traditional rich elite universities. It's much more nuanced than that. It's not just about who's got the most money, who's got the biggest endowment. But this really, really demonstrates some excellence. You've got an individual SDGs. You can see here SDG 4, for example, Egypt has a 55th place. Nigeria's got a world top 50 university. South Africa's got a world 31st ranked university. SDG 5, top 100 for Nigeria, top 30 for South Africa, top 100 in Egypt for 9. So you've got some really outstanding performers across individual SDGs. Lots of African universities comfortably in the world top 50, top 30. SDG 17, you've got an Egyptian in 24th. And actually, I'll just show you who these guys are. So this is a sort of shout out to the inaugural participants, but also those who've shown really strong performance in individual SDGs. Ain Sham's good health and well-being, 71st in the world. Western Cape, 31st in the entire world for quality education. Ibadan, world top 50 for quality education. And this is great because it's much more about the contributions you're making to help improve education in your nations, in your societies. It's producing trained teachers. Gender equality, Western Cape, 28th in the world. Johannesburg, a world top 50. The Egyptians doing well again, top hundreds for decent work in economic growth and the industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Again, Egypt doing well on responsible consumption and production. 72nd for Alexandria on climate action. I think peace, justice, strong institutions should be a really powerful one for Africa as well. This is actually about law, justice, strong institutions, governance. So Western Cape, 51st in the entire world. Alexandria, 55th. I mean, we should say this is of the 500 and odd universities that submitted. As this ranking grows and more people submit, there will be some instability there. But it's a really great first stab to show African universities really standing out on a world stage. Alexandria 24th for Partnerships for the Goals. Quick mention, I mentioned this last night, but this is the world top 10 for reduced inequalities. And just in case you hadn't seen it clearly enough, the University of Johannesburg, our host, is the 5th strongest in the world for its work on reducing inequalities. These are the things that African universities are doing so well, so powerfully. And again, I have to say, I'd be very sorry if loads more universities come into the second round and loads more people submit, and there will be some instability, but it's exactly the sort of thing we should be championing and recognizing strengths for. Actually, Australia was outstanding in this field. Top 3 were Australian universities, but also you got the US, Taiwan, Western Cape, 10th for this metric as well. So really great showing for Africa, and 2 South African universities in the world top 10. Just a quick note to embarrass them a little bit more. Some of my colleagues have put this slide together. An outstanding example of evidence in the submission was from UJ. So if, I don't know if Professor Mwala and his team, I don't know if they could set up a consultancy business, but if you want advice on submitting successfully, the data team said their submission was exemplary in terms of providing that evidence, making the claim, providing the evidence, giving our data team the resource they need to actually ratify and confirm and quality assure the data. So I don't want to put a great burden on you, but if you want advice on submission, if you haven't submitted, UJ, you could come to them. You could, of course, come to us as well. We'll certainly want to help you. And I'm deliberately leaving some time for Q&A, so please do think of questions, because there's probably about another 15 minutes left. But I just want to talk to you about what we do next. So that was a pilot. We did only have 11 SDGs and then the 17. So this year we're trying to expand to the entire 17, so you can submit to any one of the 17 SDGs. We're now in the process of reviewing the methodology. Did we get it right? Were our definitions clear enough? Were our requests for data reasonable? Were we asking for things that you could actually provide evidence for? If you have feedback, we'd really welcome it. Did we make mistakes? I had a very constructive criticism. I was in Toronto just last week, and U of T, the University of Toronto, didn't do very well in the health metric. Because when we ask for how many people you're producing graduating into nursing and health professions, we ask for it as a proportion of your total graduates. So we reward a high proportion. And Toronto was saying, well, hang on a minute. We produce thousands and thousands of people into health because we're huge. Surely the thousands of people we put into health have a higher impact than the hundreds that university puts into health, just because the hundreds are a higher proportion of the total. So there's quite a lot of refinement around, have we asked the right question? Have we measured it in the right way? So we're really, really open to consultation. Workload's an interesting one. How much do we demand of the universities? And bibliometrics, we're using a kind of algorithm to pull out specific search terms and specific words in the research. There's some work going on with this European Aurora project to say, are there better ways of being more accurate in pulling out the research papers that are directly speaking to the SDGs? So the process and nomenclature around that. And of course, we want to try and do as much as we can with the results. How do we turn the results back onto the sector and say, yes, we're giving recognition for good performance to these universities, but can we use the results for policy lobbying? Can we actually help universities use them to take them to government and say, this is proof that you need to give us more funding. We're actually helping change the world. We're helping change society. We're contributing to economic growth. We're reducing inequalities. We are having an impact beyond what the popular imagination might perceive. Give us some funding. We'll give it back to you. We'll return the investment. And then obviously, of course, we now have this amazing opportunity to share the good practice. We didn't know that UJ was one of the strongest universities in the world for its work in reducing inequalities. Now we do. We can say, right, UJ, come and stand on a stage in America and tell us how we can all do better. Tell every university leader how they can improve too. How can we collectively reduce inequality across the world? So we have these great examples now that we can share to help everyone else get better, help everyone else make a better contribution to the SDGs, help genuinely. We recognize the great work you are doing towards making the world a better place, but we can absolutely incentivize and improve and share good practice to make sure you make an even better contribution. And then the last line there is ensure greater participation from Africa. We feel strongly that this continent as a whole should be embracing this, and we welcome data submissions, we welcome people getting involved, and we will put together a support network to support people in submitting data. So we have about 15 minutes left. I'm really happy. I think I might sit, cough. I'll sit down. But if anyone does have questions, we have 15 or so minutes. And then, of course, the second session after the break is all about exploring our rankings right, how do they evolve. So there's lots of time to talk over lunch as well. But for now, if anyone has any questions, I'm delighted to answer them. And I see there's a very few hands being held up. Oh, thank you. Thanks for surviving the coughs. So we do have a question. Thank you.
Let me break the ice. Yeah. Okay. My name is Nico Elema. I'm from the University of Stellenbosch. Just two questions I have, and it's, you've probably heard a lot of comments, feedback on the indicators. And in Africa, South Africa produce about 30% of the, research output. I know it's just one indicator. But I always, when I see people say Africa has produced so much, but South Africa producing, scoring and making such a big chunk out of the data, it might be skewed a little bit. And then also, I just have a question on, do you take into consideration per capita, populations? We always try to normalize the data. Nigeria's got 180 million people, South Africa 58 million. And so that also translates to the number of universities in a country. And I've done some research in Southern Africa. And if you take the per capita into consideration, we never think of Botswana. But they suddenly pop onto the radar because of their low population. And but they produce quality as well. So maybe there might be room to consider per capita, and I don't know if you probably do already, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think they're really fair points. I think as much as possible we want to disaggregate the data, and I think it is very difficult to talk about such a diverse continent as Africa when the elephant in the room really is actually the quality in South Africa is a bit more concentrated, and the relative wealth is higher. And I think we can see that as we disaggregate to individual universities, of course. But yeah, it is hard to talk about Africa as a whole when it's such a diverse area. And that's why I think as much as possible we're trying to reduce it to let's look at individual universities. I think the per capita one is fascinating. There's a lot we can do with the data. So we have so much data now, there's a huge amount we could do. And I think I've always wanted to do something more explicitly about what I'd call bang for buck, which is basically performance relative to the resources going in. And I think you'd see some real outstanding performers across the whole continent. There was one chart that we tried to reflect the population in the sense of the bubble size for the wealth and performance chart. Is the bubble size was to say actually that because we're only looking at ranked universities, if those ranked universities are only educating a tiny proportion of the total youth population, then we have a problem that they might have some outstanding universities, but actually if they're still quite elitist and they're not actually producing they're not contributing to society in quite the same way because they're not actually educating in very large numbers. There are some issues. But yeah, I mean, I think it's something simply we could do. We could just do ranked institutions per capita, and hopefully we can start pulling out some new insights, as you say, for Botswana. So the data's there. We can do it. Perhaps we should do more of it. That's not quite an answer to the question, but yeah, I acknowledge that is an issue. Did you have a question as well?
Thank you. I'm Stephanie Burton. I'm the Vice Principal for Research at the University of Pretoria. I'm interested in the fact that it doesn't seem to me that you've included in the impact rankings a reputation score or some kind of feedback from external stakeholders, whereas, of course, in your other rankings, you do have that. And, based on what the global perceptions are around broad impact and social benefit and relevance and so on, did you not consider putting in some kind of reputation or consultation from stakeholders into the impact rankings?
It's an excellent question, because the answer is yes, we did. So actually, when we do the reputation survey for the world rankings, it's relatively straightforward to identify the respondents. Because with the world rankings, we say we want scholars, we want peers. So what we do is we use the Elsevier database of published academics. So we know we know which country they're from the author address. We know which university they're from the author address. We know which field they're in from the journal title, and we know that they are at least have enough subject knowledge that they've managed to publish in a world journal. So that's a good mechanism for controlling the sample. So we can control, it's random distribution, but we control for nationality and subject specialism. And you're absolutely right, we had a long, hard think about how we could do the same for impact. But the problem we kept coming across is how do we get a really high quality global sample of relevant experts? And we wondered, could we actually do some sort of global survey of NGOs or something like that? Or so the short answer is we definitely have thought of it, but we haven't yet thought of a satisfactory way of getting a really good quality and fair, globally balanced sample. So again, I'd welcome ideas, actually. Is there a constituency of people around the world that we could ask? Or is it skewed towards one of the SDGs over others? So we're definitely keen to do it. Or could we set up international panels, for example, and do it in that way? But yes, we're interested, keen, but haven't fathomed a way of doing it really effectively yet. Because I think we always, with Times Higher Education, we're really keen to not publish anything unless we're really comfortable with the sort of statistical rigor of the work. So it's just getting that sample right and identifying them and then reaching them. Of course, reaching them and getting responses is a big challenge as well. But we very much welcome ideas around that. And Mike's just on its way.
Thank you, Phil. Tawana Kube, I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria. So your earlier slide was very interesting in that I think the largest number of entrants were from Europe, if I'm not mistaken, 147.
Yeah.
And am I correct to say that this is voluntary participation? You are not just you won't rank people who didn't enter, right?
Yeah, so actually, I think probably one of the things we should have done better is publicized it more. Mm-hmm. So we announced we're doing it, and in a way it was almost as if the more avid and loyal readers of Times Higher Education magazine and website perhaps were more engaged. So we announced that we're planning it, we announced there's various procedures and timings, we revealed plans at various forums and public meetings, but it was completely voluntary. So it was those institutions who were aware, those institutions who had the time and resource to do it within a very constrained time frame. Mm-hmm. I guess the biggest challenge for us, of course, was that we have very, very good access to the 1,500 or so universities that participate in the world rankings. So we're able to sort of directly communicate and say, hey, we've got the new ranking, do you want to be involved? But actually for this one, it's so much more widely open to non-world ranked universities. Mm-hmm. Our ability to reach those universities is more limited because they're not already stakeholders and engaged partners.
So what I also wanted to ask was, if you look at the SDGs, just generally they pertain to, for lack of a better word and for lack of time, to the less developed parts of the world. So then it's interesting that 147 universities from the developed world entered. How they performed is another story. are we going to, do you think if you think forward, when everybody gets going or more people participate, you could find a situation where the highly ranked universities on SDGs are in the developed part of the world, and the lowly ranked universities in the impact rankings are from the developing world? What would that mean?
Well, I think it would be, I mean, I can't predict it, but I, in a way, I think it would be a vindication of this work. Because obviously you look at somewhere like MIT and they're doing amazing work on climate change and they're doing some fantastic things that make the world a better place. And of course their new knowledge creation it will change things forever, and they invent things, and it's wonderful, and we should celebrate that. But I'd be disappointed if we had this ranking in 3 or 4 years' time when it's the same universities at the top. And I do believe this one is a way of ensuring that that's not the case. It's actually saying that, you know, you could argue that, you know, a wonderful research university's own carbon footprint, for example, could be very poor. A university that's so focused on new knowledge creation that they neglect local needs and local economic growth requirements. Certainly some of the best universities in the world are poor on access, poor on inclusion. So I do hope that this genuinely provides a level playing field for universities that are not rich, not prestigious, don't necessarily have centuries of history, can show that they do make a really, really important contribution to the world, and they have excellence. It's understanding that excellence doesn't always have to be, I won a Nobel Prize. It could be that I revolutionized, sorry, I'm being slightly cliched here, but you know, we put in a water purification system into a town, and we saved hundreds of lives. They're all different types of excellence. It's just, we need to show that excellence comes in many shapes and sizes, and we should recognize it all. So I hope we can show that in the ranking. I think we could squeeze another one in if there's any interest. Yes, please. I have two here. Well, let's put both questions in so I can cover them both off. And I think, Lorraine, do we want to try and do a group photograph now? Yeah. So let's just take these two questions, and then I think there's a little bit of arrangement for a photo, if that's all right.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. My name is Nelson Toto, and I'm from the African Academy of Sciences. One of the things that we are trying to advocate is to ensure that research is available, the research output is available to the researchers within a reasonable time. And obviously the open publishing platforms are something that we see as the future. How do you think that will impact in terms of your parameters that you use for the rankings?
I think that's a fantastic question. Can we just squeeze in the other question first, and then I can answer them both, because we're just a bit tight on time. But thank you, I think that's really important.
Good morning. My name is Nyaraich Banda from Midland State University in Zimbabwe. And my question is, I've noted that from our country, which is Zimbabwe, we have about 18 universities, but none of them is ranked in the Times Higher Education matrix. And from what you were saying, it's basically voluntary, but is Times doing anything to encourage such countries to also participate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on open access, I think we imagine that will revolutionize global science. And I think it's interesting, actually, because Times Higher Education has a partnership with Elsevier to obtain bibliometric data. So we use the data to analyze research. But we're fascinated by the fact that the current model of publishing is clearly causing huge problems. That, you've got a crazy scenario where the taxpayer pays academics to carry out research, and then the taxpayer, the ordinary member of the public, and the person who's done the research can't read the research because it's behind a paywall. So I do think that model is beginning to disintegrate, and I think that's important. Public access to research, open access to research has to be the way forward. We're a global community wanting to solve some of the biggest challenges in the world. Knowledge must be shared. So Elsevier works at Times Higher Education, but I would personally say the Elsevier model is under huge pressure. And of course it's not Elsevier, it's all the big academic publishers. They bring great value, they bring the peer review process, they bring the quality assurance systems, the editorial elements. So there is a quality assurance process that they bring, which is important, and we need to ensure research goes through that quality assurance process rather than just publishing anything and hoping the great stuff will be discovered. But I do think the model needs to change, and I think one of the things Times High could do is actually potentially even give credit to the research that is open access. It's something we haven't got a clear view on it yet, but it's something that we believe is we should be encouraging and supporting without compromising on the vital quality assurance aspect that the peer review process and the publishing process brings. We need to open it up. But hopefully, again, once these open access movements grow and grow like Plan S, the access to research will be greater, which means the ability to build on that research is stronger. And again, not sharing knowledge is vital. So it'll help, perhaps help with the equalizing access to research and then equalizing research outputs because more people have more access to the new ideas. In terms of Zimbabwe, so yes, it's true, we have an entirely voluntary system. So even in the world rankings, we won't rank you unless you've actively stepped forward and actively chosen to submit information to us. So we would never take data from the internet. We'd never scrape information. We'd have to say, find someone at the university at a senior level who's saying, yes, we've actively chosen to participate. So we have various systems of reaching out. So we have, our reputation service gives us a sense of strong institutions. The research data gives us a sense of universities who are in our scope for the world rankings. But I think it's probably fair to say that we need to be more aggressive in reaching out and saying to universities, we've seen that you're doing the kind of work that should be included in the rankings. We should go and knock on the door and go and be more persuasive. We do often send out emails saying, we've identified you as eligible for world rankings. Are you interested? But and there's a system to do it, but whether we're proactive enough in getting out there and saying, hey, why are you not in the rankings? Going out to Zimbabwe, putting on a workshop. So I agree, we need to work harder to reach out. Every year we're putting a few hundred more universities into the system. So I think this year about 1,700 have submitted. But what happens is we also have to balance it out to say, we persuade universities to submit, and sometimes they may not make the cut because there's a threshold problem or a slight problem. So we don't want to encourage universities to put huge time and effort in without reward. But at the same time, it's the more sharing, the more we have people in the database, the more we can be helpful in sharing intelligence and insights. So yeah, we should probably go knock on doors a bit harder. We've run out of time, but there's a photo we need to arrange. Is that right?
Yes, there is. Well, thank you very much. Phil is our
Thank you. Thank you.